Standardized testing is something that has been used in education for centuries. The Glossary of Education Reform defines standardized testing as, quote, any form of test that requires all test takers to answer the same questions or a selection of questions from a common bank of questions, and that is scored in a standard or consistent manner, which makes it possible to compare relative performance of individual students or groups of students. While different types of tests and assessments may be standardized in that way, the term is primarily associated with large-scale tests administered to large populations of students. This quote is from the 2015 article, Standardized Testing. That definition may not sound bad. However, I want to persuade you that standardized testing needs to be abolished in schools for many reasons. It does not test situational knowledge, but rather the ability to memorize. It does not take into account creativity, and it gives students more stress and anxiety. There are many arguments for continuing to keep standardized testing around. Some people will claim that standardized test scores reflect student knowledge and information about how students learn. Or, these test scores are useful to teachers. Neither of these statements are true. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to suggest the very opposite of these claims. The National Center for Fair and Open Testing claims that standardized testing does not provide information about how students learn information, nor does it reflect what students have learned, stating, quote, while our understanding of the brain and how people think has progressed enormously, standardized testing has remained the same. Test makers will assume that knowledge can be broken into separate bits and pieces, and that people will learn by absorbing these individual parts. Today, cognitive and developmental psychologists understand that knowledge is not separable by bits, and that people, including children, learn by connecting what they already know with what they're trying to learn. If they cannot actively make meaning out of what they are doing, they will not remember it. The same source goes on to say, in an argument against testing helping teachers, classroom surveys show most teachers do not find scores from standardized tests useful. These tests do not help a teacher understand what to do next in working with a student, because they do not indicate how the student learns or thinks, nor do they measure how much of what students should learn. Both of these quotes were found in an article edited and published in October 2023 by FairTest. Both of these quotes show that standardized testing does not show a teacher how a student learns best. Despite tremendous discoveries of how the brain in adolescence, standardized testing does not change and is still something that is used. Standardized testing focuses more on students memorizing information rather than taking information and applying it to real-life situations. Standardized testing also doesn't take into account creativity. This goes back to standardized testing being only memorization. This also has to do with standardized testing being only in core subjects. In a 2024 article written by Peter Morrell, the author claims, much recent research on intelligence and human cognitive developmental suggests that standardized tests are not a valid measure of excellence or scholastic aptitude. Schools which overemphasize standardized tests and test-wise training are immersing students in modes of thinking that only trivialize knowledge, but are also irrelevant to real-life problem solving. Failure to acknowledge the aptitudes not measured by standardized tests can deprive children of important opportunities for intellectual growth. Lastly, standardized testing gives students more stress and anxiety. An article posted by George Lucas Education Foundation and published in October 2023 states, as high-stakes tests loom, cortisol levels, a chemical marker for stress, rise by an average of 15%, a psychological response linked to an 80-point drop in SAT scores, according to 2018 research. For students who are already experiencing hardships outside of school, such as poverty, neighborhood violence, or family instability, for instance, cortisol spiked as much as 35%, a level that is likely to derail cognitive processes and distort test scores beyond recognition. So what do these tests really measure? Are high-stakes tests measuring the impact of stressors like depression, family divorces, or test themselves rather than knowledge. Many students face test anxiety, and this quote proves that not only does the test itself cause anxiety, but the anxiety causes lower test scores, and it's a cycle that continues to repeat. In conclusion, standardized testing needs to be abolished. Standardized tests don't take into account many factors. These tests do not help students. They only cause more stress and anxiety. I like to end with a quote from Frederick J. Kelly, the man who invented standardized testing. He said, "These tests are too crude to be used and need to be abandoned."